Lunch and Crunch. It's so much better.
It also helps if I turn my audio on while I go into that big long spiel. So you missed
Oh
nothing.
no.
You missed nothing.
Oh, you missed nothing. Oh no, we have no audio. Okay, so there was a long spiel. I'm just going to say, welcome to Lunch and Crunch, in which we talk about our food and our tea and our games, which sounds a lot less talky than what Eddy said. You didn't miss anything.
Right, you didn't miss anything. You missed me rambling on, which is what you listen to for the next hour. So it's all good.
I mean, I feel like that's pretty on brand for us. So whatever.
That is
Right.
fair.
Speaking of lunch and tea, what are you having for lunch today, Eddy?
So I remembered to bring lunch this time as opposed to last time where I completely forgot to do so. So I have a pumpkin muffin that my wife made, which is really, really good.
Oh, yum.
And tea today, over here, is the last of my Underdark and Chill tea, which is a combination of black tea, oil of bergamot, vanilla, cornflower petals, and lavender.
Oh my God, that sounds amazing.
It's actually really good. It is. It's a nice strong black tea, which I tend to like. So yeah, it's really, really tasty. How about you?
I am surprising only maybe a few. I'm making myself a hamburger in my air fryer for lunch today, which means I don't have it with me because I didn't want to eat a hamburger this early in my day, because while it's noon for you, it's only 11 for me.
Right, and you like.
So instead, I have the patty is resting on the counter, so it'll be nice and room temperature by the time I throw it in the air fryer.
Oh, nice, good call.
But I do have a snack, which are these little lemon cookies. So they're Girl Scout cookies, and they're called
Oh.
lemonades.
Ooh.
And I've tried every variation of the Girl Scout cookie lemon cookies, and they've never been as good as this. And when I tell you that I've gone through an entire box of these things in the past 2 days, like I regret not buying more of them.
I regret nothing.
I regret nothing about eating them. That's true, but like they're just. I've never had such a good, like they're the perfect. It's like a shortbread cookie, but that's lemon.
Oh, that does sound really,
Like
really good.
yeah, right. Like it's so good. And then for my tea today, which I will show you my mug.
Powered by Spite. I love that one.
Yes, my tea today is also a strong black tea. It's a Fortnum and Mason tea that is a wedding breakfast tea. So it was made for a royal wedding #1, the one that the royals actually like.
Right.
Right. I picked this up a while ago, back whenever we could travel, in the airport, actually, because, they have all the duty-free, like, places, and you can buy, like, stuff that, maybe you wouldn't find in just a regular shop or whatever. And I was like, oh, I'm going to try a selection of teas. And the Fortnum and Mason teas, I'm sure Matthew would tell me exactly how bougie this tea is, but I'm pretty sure it's bougie even for British standards, but has become one of my favorite teas. So I am now, oh yes, there's a dog in my stream.
Oh, yeah, it's dog.
Yeah, she's
Just chilling.
she's chilling. She's just being a dog, doing dog things. Anyway, this tea is it's kind of it's a strong black tea, which I need. I always put cream in it. I don't always put cream in every tea I drink, but this is definitely one that pretty much begs to have cream in it,
Yeah.
to make it kind of a richer flavor. And I drink it lightly sweetened with honey. And I would tell you all of the notes and hints in it, but honestly, I drink it really hot and really fast. And it's such a staple of my life now that I don't even remember why I love it. Like, as far as like, it's just a really good black tea. That it's a breakfast tea,
Oh,
right?
okay.
So it has all the flavors of a breakfast tea. Um, but yeah, there you go. With a hint of royal wedding. That's the flavor, right?
Yes, it's like the birthday cake and the
Yeah.
sparkles.
Yes. Like rainbows and joy.
Nice. I forgot to mention the company that makes my tea blend. If people are interested, is called DNT.
Oh
So
yes.
like Dungeons and Dragons, but with tea at the end.
Oh, nice.
dandtea.com if you're interested in that.
I am, because that sounded very lovely. Also, for those wondering about where they can also get this fabulous Powered by Spite mug, because it is honestly one of the best purchases I've ever made. You can find this on the Nerdy Kepi website, which is just Nerdy Kepi, Keppie. I'll put a Dixie's in here. She might put a link to it.
Yeah.
But or I'll type in a link. But they are they have a lot of queer stuff. They're run and operated by a queer Jewish family, and they have a lot of neat stuff. They have a lot of queer stuff, but also this fantastic Powered by Spite mug. Because, well, I am powered mostly by my spite. There's other things I'm powered by, but this one today is especially true.
It kind of reminds me of my mug, which is life is too short to argue with anonymous assholes on the internet.
Ah, that's very true. Yes.
The advice I sometimes follow.
That is advice that the more I follow it, the better my life is.
Right.
So, like, it's top tier advice is really what it is.
Oh, it's good advice. Doesn't mean I follow it.
I mean, yes.
But speaking of advice that people can follow, let's talk about subsystems. Yeah, last time we talked about kind of core resolution, and we spent some good conversations on kind of the nuts and bolts of Storypath. Right. And so today, I think you wanted to talk a bit more about kind of subsystems, what they are, and kind of going through some of the subsystems that Storypath has. We'll use Trinity as our base for discussion today.
Right. Trinity, and I might bring up Scion Origin just a little bit, just because sure. There's a couple of things in Scion Origin that get talked about a little better than Trinity Core talks about it, specifically conditions, I think. Although the conditions in Trinity Core are pretty good. But let's talk about, we talked about complications and all of that jazz, momentum, all the core stuff. So right. Let's start with conditions, because I think everything else kind of hinges on what a condition is. Mm-hmm. And not everything, but a lot of the other subsystems kind of key into conditions in a way that I wish we had described them better the first time around. So a condition is something that applies to your character, applies to your character in a way that is a prolonged effect. So it's not something that's just going to happen once and be done. They often provide momentum when the bad thing comes up, whatever that bad thing is. Mm-hmm. And then they have some kind of resolution mechanic that you just need to do to resolve them. And sometimes the text of them is, until the end of the scene, resolves immediately. In Scion, a lot of boons create conditions on people And then when the scion themselves pull like retrieves their legend, whatever they imbued, um, to into the boon, then that will resolve the condition. There are other ways to resolve the condition, but sometimes the scion themselves can resolve it.
Right.
So conditions are an interesting thing because, we have conditions in Chronicles of Darkness, and I think a lot of the design for that kind of made its way into Storypath. But we have a lot of conditions that show up in completely different ways. Um, so we have field conditions or field complications, and those don't apply to the character specifically so much as they apply to the general location that you're in. And so a field condition could be that you're on a boat and the boat has a condition that is, it's rocking, right? And this affects your character and it's going to affect your character in a prolonged sense, but there's no way to really resolve that sans getting off the boat or leaving the field that the condition is applying to. And these often apply complications to actions. So you can resolve individually, you cannot be affected by whatever this complication condition is applying to your character on a round by round basis by buying off a complication, or you could be affected by it if you don't have enough successes. And we didn't do a whole lot of field conditions in the core books, but we've really expanded upon them in the books that have come since then. So
yeah, like I know Dystopia Rising, for example, uses a lot of them for the radiation rules, for example.
right. Dystopia Rising. I think there's a few in. There's a bunch in Titanomachy because I wrote them.
Right, and I think you put a bunch in Adventure, which is coming up, right?
Adventure has a bunch. It has even more than Titanomachy, and Monica wrote those, and they're fantastic because they're, there's stuff like you're in the middle of a volcano, or you're on a building that's collapsing, or you're on, on a train, like literally on top of a train, trying to do stuff, which are all adventure scenarios, right? Things that you would do in those kind of pulp stories. So I think that the ones in adventure are very cool setting pieces that I think will be really fantastic. Easy things for story guides to kind of pick up and be like, okay, well, here's a cool environmental effect that's going on wherever you are that really adds to the pulp flavor.
Right.
And that's really, for me, that's what field conditions are doing, is they're just adding a level of ambiance and kind of that setting grit to your game. And by grit, I don't mean like noir gritty. I just mean like sandpaper grit.
Right. I mean, so one thing that I think a lot of tabletop role-playing games struggle with is what we kind of colloquially call white rooms, right? Where a lot of combat occurs in a completely featureless space, and there's nothing interesting happening except for the people punching each other in the face, and that's it.
Right.
And different games approach this problem differently, and some games just don't deal with the problem, right? But some of them, add in like traps or kind of ad hoc little things. And one of the things I love about field conditions is that it's a relatively blanket rule. It taps into the existing condition rules, but they all make combat more interesting. I think it's that grit you're talking about. It gives a texture and a flavor to combat beyond just we're punching each other in a 10 by 10 room.
Yeah. Yeah, and yeah, when, Weird Hamster asked, and because we're talking about conditions right now, I'll go ahead and answer that, when I say long-term status, I mean it's going to last for more than one round. That doesn't mean it's going to last for days and days and days. It just means that it's not a one-time thing. It's a thing that persists over either multiple rounds or multiple time units of some sort. So yeah, a condition could last for 3 to 4 rounds. That's still a condition.
And I think that You can play with this too, because, like, for example, in the chat, Blinded was given us an example. Throwing sand in someone's eyes is blinded, but that's something that's assumed that's going to be a condition that goes away next round. Whereas something tear gas, is probably actually more of a field condition, because it covers the whole area, and that's probably going to be more of a long-term field condition that's going to last for, like I said, several rounds. The long-term stuff isn't hard-coded into the condition, and a lot of the conditions are written to be very flexible. So that way, because what all it is here's a chunk of rules, they apply until they don't apply. And the story guide can decide when they stop applying.
Right, exactly.
But yeah. To kind of go back to the core topic here, I mean, these are good kind of starting points. When we talk about subsystems like this, right? What do you think? What is the difference between a core system and a subsystem? Maybe start there.
So for me, sorry, I just put a piece of cookie in my mouth.
That's fine. If you want, I can answer that while you chew.
Okay.
Subsystems are things that help accentuate or modify the core test resolution, but are not required. Like, core resolution is, generally speaking, you're engaging with this pretty much every time you do a thing, right? This is, in video game design, this is the core gameplay loop. This is Mario's jump. This is Samus's run, whatever. This is the thing you do constantly. Subsystems are things that modify and make that core in gameplay interesting, but they come in and out as needed. Does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, I mean, when I think about it, you just talked about, like, video game, and I'm like, yes. In video game terms, subsystems are, in Hades, you have your basic weapon, and subsystems are all the blessings that the other gods give you.
Mm-hmm.
Right, they're modifiers to the core system. They're not the core system themselves. And I always think about subsystems as they may be integral to the game and making the game feel correct, right? When you play a game, the subsystems aren't secondary in the sense that you don't need them to play the game, but they are secondary in the sense that they don't, if I took out a subsystem, the game would still function. It may feel different, it may look different, it may play a little differently, but it's still playable.
Right. And one thing that took me a while to wrap my head around, but now that I've seen it, I kind of point out to people where I can, is combat is a subsystem.
Yep.
A lot of people really look at tabletop role-playing games and assume combat as a core system, and that the game needs to be balanced around combat. And that's not actually true. Right. Taking a look at something like Dungeons and Dragons, for example, a skill check works on a different level, works in a different way than an attack roll. They still use D20, but the modifiers you add change, and some of the nuances, what target number you have to hit changes. So combat is building on the core game mechanic of a D20 plus proficiency bonus plus attribute modifier, and goes in different directions with it. Right. So from our definition, yes, it's entirely possible to play D&D without combat.
Yep, absolutely.
Will be a little awkward, because it is definitely a game where combat is a primary, heavily integrated subsystem, but it is possible to play D&D without combat. It's to be able to play any game without combat, really. Yep. Unless it's a game that's specifically, like NWE Unleashed, you cannot play without combat, because it's literally the whole point of the game is punching each other in the face in a ring. I mean, that's the point of the game. You can't really do that. But in that game, combat is the core resolution system. Like, if you want to do a contract negotiation in an NWE, you do it through a wrestling match. That's the point of that game. So yes, it is possible to not have combat as a core system, but it is usually heavily tied.
Yeah, I love the concept of everything is done through a wrestling match. So it's like, I know this is completely off topic, but I'm just imagining, like, I want to turn my NWE game into a romance game, but like I want to ask you to date me, but we need to wrestle about it to find out if you do.
No, and like the funny part
now I'm suddenly like really want to play this game.
No, and that's the thing is that it's when Matthew and I designed it, that was one of the things we talked about, was because it's emulating professional wrestling, right? Because it's like there's an entire angle where I think it was in WCW, Buff Bagwell, his mother was being courted by another wrestler, and so there was actually a match where she was put on a forklift, and whoever won got to take control of Buff Bagwell's mother. It wasn't a good storyline by any imagination, but the point is, like, this domestic dispute was handled for a wrestling match.
Yeah. I'm thinking, like, that's two people fighting over one person, but I am definitely thinking about, like, date me. We're going to wrestle about it.
Oh, yeah, no, totally. It's like, if I conquer you, then you must go on this date with me. That's
yeah, or marry me. Ding, ding, ding.
Right. But I mean, also, you could theoretically design a game where the reverse is true, right? Like, you could have a game where combat is done through social encounters, and the actual, like, swinging swords and whatnot is completely secondary, but you get the kind of, like, Monkey Islands or like a swashbuckler movie snark where everyone's just kind of bantering each other, and the actual sword swinging going on is completely secondary to the actual conflict resolution, which is social.
Right. Yeah. And speaking of combat being a subsystem, you could distill combat is really just in any game, combat is literally just an extended teamwork action.
Yeah. Very intricate, but yes.
A very intricate version of it, but it's just an extended teamwork action. And, it's funny to me because sometimes I think about Storypath in terms of, like, some of the teamwork stuff with milestones and things like that. And I'm like, oh, yeah, the combat is still just the milestone is the defense. And you've got a number of milestones equal to the health. And you got to meet those, and you have to do it each in a single roll, but it's teamwork. Everybody gets to work on it, and it stands up, right? And it's funny to me because people do view, especially in adventure games, action games, as combat being the core of the system. But honestly, it is a subsystem. You could remove it entirely, use other systems to resolve things, and the game would play just fine.
Right.
It would feel different, though.
Sure. And obviously,
it would feel different.
And some rules would have to be adjusted and changed, obviously, if you do that. But yeah, it is possible. It can be done. You cannot take out difficulty, and the game stops working if you take out difficulty.
Yep.
If you remove enhancement, the game is very difficult to move ahead.
Yeah, the math stops working. The core of the game system is built to have enhancement.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, complications are still also just a subsystem. We talked about it as a core part of the system, but the game functions without them just fine. They're a subsystem, but we think that they're an important part of the game, which is why we talked about them in core systems. Yeah.
And I brought this up because there are some, again, getting your head wrapped around the idea that combat is subsystem, but there are also some elements of combat that are subsystem-y. So let me take a step back. When we did our episode last time, Danielle pointed out that it was pretty ubiquitous across Storypath games. The stuff we're talking about in that episode was pretty much, this more or less works the same way. There are very minor changes, but it pretty much works as Scion in Trinity, and they came from.
Right.
Combat is one area where it definitely changes between the games. So, like, for example, we talked about complications are core, but conditions aren't. Injuries in most Storypath games do create complications, but not from they came from A to C. It's just checkboxes.
No. Yeah, They Came From uses a really interesting system that it uses checkboxes, but it also, as you get hurt, you get more dramatic. So you get that, like, I've got a cool scar, and so now I'm more powerful.
Right.
Which I love, because in a cinematic game, the injured, protagonist it's like, oh, you beat me up, and that has fueled me. That you're in cinematic games, your protagonists are powered by spite.
We should have a stat called spite.
I mean, they are, because they take damage and they're like, this, I've kind of pulled myself together and made myself, this motivated me to do better now because I've been beat up.
Right.
I took damage and all you did was make me angry.
You wouldn't like me when I'm angry.
Right. So, there's definitely some elements to it that is, that models really well what that's doing. None of the other games do that, but that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So yeah, the complications that come from health is, that's very specific to what kind of feel we're going for each of the games, and not a core system of how the game needs to work.
Right. Because you're right, like they came from, is very much modeled on, it's fun to take damage because you actually get slightly better when you take damage, because it's emulating that, it's almost lampooning the whole protagonist gets more effective the more damage they get. Core Storypath does model that, but in a slightly oblique way. When you get injured, you take complications, which do reduce your effectiveness in very specific areas, but you use those failures to generate momentum, which you then cash in at key moments to then become more effective. So you get the same model, but they came from collapsing that. The player starts to see the kind of ridiculous thing of, why am I getting more effective when I take damage? And you start to see the mechanics are actually even selling the humor of the game slightly by taking that approach. So it's something that I have always found really fascinating when Matthew kind of put it together, because you're right, it's such an interesting way of looking at it. But again, it's both directions work in Core Storypath.
Right. So, yeah, and I think about health, and it's a little confusing. I feel like we should talk about especially Storypath health, because it creates a complication that looks a little different from other complications, because when we wrote those, they were supposed to be conditions that resolved when you got healed, that increased the difficulty of the things you were doing. And so they still increase the difficulty of the thing you're doing, but they're called they're called complications. So they don't work like other complications.
They're actually called conditions, which is something that in retrospect, there's been called entry complications, but yeah.
Right. Oh, they are, right, because you can overcome them. That's right.
Right.
Yeah, they work like complications do. I was thinking that they were increasing difficulty. They actually work like complications do, but we called them conditions. It's weird and sometimes a little confusing. Even I am confused by it in this very moment.
The only reason why I know the difference is because I literally just put it up on the screen. I highlighted it in Trinity, and the section's called injury conditions, but inside the text, we do call it injury complications. So, I mean, it's... and I think it's good to kind of take a step back and point out that, like you mentioned last episodes, that these are the first Storypath games. We were still kind of finding our feet, and it was still a little muddy even in our heads, the nuance between condition and complication. I remember early on, there was this vague idea of complications are kind of in-the-moment conditions, and then conditions are kind of longer-term conditions. But that bifurcated pretty quickly in design. We never really kind of fully pulled those apart, and so every once in a while you do see these kind of moments of like, oh, it's a little unclear.
I'm laughing at Dixie's comment. Look, this show is not here to always make us look good, okay? Like, sometimes we have to admit that we also make mistakes.
Right, yeah. Definitely Dixie was the editor on that, so sorry.
That's okay. Speaking of mistakes, I'm about to make a big one. That's a good segue, because I think this is something that we should definitely talk about.
Is this the conversation I think it is?
Oh yeah. So I get this question a lot, so we're gonna fucking talk about fucking scale.
There it is. Boom. Scale.
Everybody take a moment to press F to pay respects. And then we'll talk about scale. So, sorry, the chat.
Now the F's are coming in. It's great.
Now the F's are coming. It's great. So, scale. We're going to talk about scale in a holistic sense. So I'm going to, explain what I think scale is, and when I say that, what I want scale to be and what it should be versus what it says. Because I think that in the sense of what it says, we have a single confusing factor that I would remove if I were to do it again. It's not there to be confusing. It's there for, context. But I think that it is not as useful as I'd hoped it would be. So scale is a comparative tool. Scale is the difference between two people or two things trying to do a thing at the same time. And that's it. It's not an objective measure in any way, shape, or form. It never has been. It never will be. But what we did was we included some example of things at different scales, which implied that it was objective.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not. And I would never put scale 1 is like a knife and scale 2 is like a gun. I would never do that again.
Right. Because
that's not actually useful, and all it does is muddy and confuse the issue.
Mm-hmm.
So the real question is, how do you apply scale, or how do I know how cool my character is between, because I have scale? And the answer is your character's cool.
Right, exactly.
And the scale only matters when you're taking a specific action and that action applies to an opposition that can also take that action, or, you're doing something at the same time as somebody else, or you're doing something against somebody else, and you have scale applied to it. And then you compare scale, and and that's, the numbers on scale are literally just a comparison tool. I have 3, you have 1. I'm beating you. I win.
Right.
That's it. That's it.
And for me, it was funny how they came from the Sea actually as the best example of scale. Because I remember writing the scale rules for Beneath the Sea, and I was so excited because scale works perfectly for the Godzilla problem, right? Where there's a giant aquatic monster is coming out from the sea. All the military pull their guns out, start shooting at it, and go, our guns don't work. That's scale, right? It doesn't matter. You don't have a metric of how thick the monster's skin is or whatever. It's purely narrative in the sense of the scale of the monster's defense is so high that guns are completely ineffective, and we don't have to bother even rolling dice. They're just sit there and go, and nothing happens. And that's what scale is used for, is that kind of stuff. Or I'm a speedster, I'm the Flash, and I'm trying to outrun a car. Can I do that? Y or N? And right. Just being able to compare those, look at those numbers, 5 is bigger than 2, so yeah, probably. That's really the whole point of the numbers.
Yeah, but and we should not be giving scale to weapons just because they're listed as example of a certain level of scale, and that was a mistake that I made, and you can all point at me and laugh.
Well, I mean, yes and no. Going back to the Godzilla modifier, right? A tank might damage it. And so the tank is higher scale than, say, a pistol or a rifle. But that is not how people traditionally use tabletop role-playing games. Right. But you see a number, and you somehow has to tie into the damage math. And so peek behind the curtain, Danielle and I, we kind of prep these shows ahead of time, and kind of pre-talk through what we're going to talk about. And the one thing that I kind of hit on when we were discussing this is cocktail recipes. Recently, I've gotten really into making cocktails. And I've noticed that there's kind of two categories of cocktail recipes. My previous experience recipes are generally pretty exact, particularly in baking. You have to measure and be very careful in degrees or importance and all of that. And cocktail recipes tend to fall into two categories, which is exact recipe, 2.5 ounces of this, 0.5 ounces of that, put them together. And sometimes they're also comparative. 1 part this to 1 part that, or put a dash of this, or add this to taste. And I think what Danielle's kind of been hitting on is that we gave the impression that scale was an exact measurement of something, and aberrance was a half step in both directions in that regard. But scale's really meant to be more of a comparative component. So it's like, okay, I am 3 parts faster than your 1 part speed. How does that relate? It is not 275 miles per hour versus 65 miles per hour or whatever.
Right, and that's like, it's a perfect analogy, because if you're comparing things, and some of that does have a little bit of objective measure, but it's something that, a scale is one of those things that worked perfectly fine until aberrant showed up.
Right.
And when we wrote scale, we did think, okay, aberrant's going to be a thing, and we're probably going to use scale for aberrant, but we're discussing it in terms of, comparisons, and, that will make sense when we get there. And then we got there and everything fell apart.
Right.
And, sometimes you write stuff and it makes perfect sense to you, and then somebody else reads it and it was like, what is this gobbledygook? And you're like, well, that made perfect sense to me. I don't understand why you don't understand it. And when you're the one who's writing it, of course it makes perfect sense to you. But it was clear that it did not make perfect sense to everyone else around us. And so we spent some time not rewriting things, but re-examining how to explain scale in a way that made the most sense.
Right.
And I wrote a blog post about it. I answered questions about it. It is the never-ending bugaboo.
Right.
Every time we talk about Storypath mechanics, when somebody says, "Oh, scale," and honestly, the correct answer is, once again, I'm never going to come to your house and tell you that you're using a game wrong.
Right.
I don't care if you're using the game. I don't care if you're just not even reading the mechanics right. I don't care if you've got everything wrong. I'm not going to come to your house and tell you about it or be mad at you. Do it wrong. I don't care. Other people in your game might care, but that's up to you for you to interact with. And the one thing I don't want is for scale, or the conversation about scale, to be a point of contention that always comes up at people's tables.
Right.
Right, where they're always angry at each other because they can't agree. I think we have gotten it to a point where it is not contentious.
Mm-hmm.
There may be some questions still of, like this question that Weird Hamster posted about, objectively, some weapons are literally just more powerful than others. So, but I would say that, if you're comparing a cannonball to a building, then the cannonball is going to do what it's supposed to do and knock down a building, or knock down a wall of a building. And if you've got a human that's being hit by a cannonball, then maybe that's not even something you need to roll about, right? Like, that's not something that you need to have a conversation about with your GM, where it's like, you got slammed in the face by a fucking wrecking ball. Like, oh, okay, well, this person's going to be flattened out.
Right.
But if they're a person with scale, then we can have a conversation about what the cannonball scale is or the wrecking ball scale is supposed to be. I said cannonball, and then I started talking about wrecking balls. I don't know.
They're basically the same, right? I mean, they're pretty much functionally identical.
Functionally identical. They knock down shit.
Right.
They're big and...
But I think you bring a point, and it kind of ties back to the startup, and we mentioned it with the subsystems, is that Aberrant was a great kind of ground zero for the scale discussion, because a lot of superhero games do something that looks a whole lot like scale, but isn't. They have comparative numbers that always exist and are persistent. And I'm always 3 times faster. I'm always 5 times stronger, what have you. And what Aberrant specifically, and Trinity in general, and Storypath in general try to do is these are meant to be situational comparisons. So the cannonball example comes up. If I have scale 5 armor, then yes, figuring out the scale of the cannonball becomes relevant in that moment for that situation. But in general, if I'm shooting a cannonball at a building, we kind of know what the results are going to be. We don't need to constantly bring in scale and adjust it. The point is, I'm not sure what what the results of this would be. I need a number to compare them, so I can quickly, as a story guide, go, okay, I need a number of enhancements to apply to one side or the other, so I can move this game ahead.
Right. And that's the thing, right? It's not that it's always applying and it always matters, right? Like, I'm shooting you with a gun and I've got scale because of it. Mm-hmm. It's more like, I am a scion and I have increased my scale by 2 from 0 to 2. And now I want to catch this cannonball out of the air. Can I do it while it's, flying forward? And can I do it without injury? And that's when the story guide says, okay, well, a cannonball would probably be scale 2 or 3. So or no. Right. And that's when that matters.
Right.
It's scale only matters when it matters. Otherwise, we don't really talk about it.
Right. So in Aberrant's case, scale is a huge part of the game, because the whole point of it, you're just superheroic, larger-than-life actions. So scale is pretty central, and we had to really dig in and clarify and codify what scale was for Aberrant specifically. But I almost never use scale in a straight Trinity Continuum game. It just doesn't really come up very often.
No, it's going to come up, And that's one of the things that, scale comes up in Scion, but scale comes up in Scion for feats of strength, right? Mm-hmm. Feats of ability, feats of social prowess, feats of, but it's a feat, right? It's a momentary boost, because when you use legend to increase your scale, you do it for a moment. And you do it to, pick up a car and throw it out of the way, or to, or to convince somebody that you're trying to, convince to do a thing. You use your leadership and you say, okay, you got to do this thing. And it happens, it's a momentary thing, and then it's done. And when I say, okay, well, I need scale for this, so let's discuss it, that's when we start applying numbers. But, and there may be a thing where it's like, okay, well, you're going up against, something really big and scary. I want to punch the tank. And, your story guide says, well, that thing has scale. You're going to need to apply scale to do any kind of injury to it, unless you have a big weapon that's intended to punch through a tank's armor. And then if you do, we don't talk about scale at all, because they're essentially probably at the same scale level for their 2 respective things. Mm-hmm. Right. And so I think that, it wants to be intuitive. And I think that in most cases, it can be intuitive when you're thinking about, where do I apply scale and when do I apply scale? But yeah, games like Aberrant, where I have all these superpowers and extraordinary abilities and things that make me super fast, super tough, super durable, super smart, whatever. And it's like, when can I apply that? And that's less intuitive. And so we tried to give a lot of rules to talk about when you could apply those things. And that made the rest of it feel like, okay, well, is it not as intuitive as the rest of it felt?
Right.
And it's like, no, everything else is still as intuitive as it feels. It's just Aberrants break those rules because they fuck with the laws of physics and every other thing in the world.
Right. And I think actually the punching a tank analogy is a good example. Like, a talent says, I'm punching a tank. Cool, you break your hands. Have an injury condition, we move on. Because in the real world, we can look at that situation and go, nothing meaningful is going to happen. If Divis Mal punches a tank, okay, there may be something in his back pocket that can allow him to do that, so we need to actually start looking at rules and seeing, okay, how that actually applies. Oh no, Monica's here to talk about piece of scale. Damn it.
Yeah, it's like I said it, and she like summoned her.
Hey, everybody. So, I mean, this goes back to kind of what I was talking about with the cocktail recipe analogy, was that we say all of this. This isn't how you're using scale is completely wrong. And to a point that someone mentioned in the chat, we recognize that understanding what scale is trying to do is to help homogenize how you apply scale at your table. We get that, and that's where we kind of fell down a little bit in explaining that. But scale as a design, scale as we implement in the books, is not broken. It's not wrong. It's just understanding that, getting the mental shift of something we thought was pretty intuitive of like, okay, when you don't have a clear real-world answer and straight dice rolling is not going to be adequate, we have this mechanic as a judgment tool to kind of bring it in. Now you have some of that context, and going forward, we can make that clear in future books to kind of help solidify that. But I've had so many people, and lots of people in the chat have even said, once you get scale, and actually even some of the other stuff like field conditions, once it kind of clicks in your head, oh, this is what's happening, it becomes amazing. It's like there's so many cool things you can do with scale. I know my aha moment was trying to figure out how to make lots of zombies. I want to get the thing of a single zombie is basically worthless. A bunch of zombies is terrifying component, and just adding more and more dice to the problem wasn't the issue. And finally, it's like, oh, hordes of zombie are at scale. And that just so quickly solved that issue. And I've had lots of people say, oh, this makes zombie movies so much more sense because, again, it's a narrative measure. The trope of it is that hordes of zombies are scary, individual zombies aren't. And so we're able to use scale to emulate a specific trope. Whereas if we were doing, say, a high fantasy game, I probably wouldn't apply scale to large groups of minions because you're the warrior that can plow through at Helm's Deep and just cut your way through hundreds of orcs to get to your objective.
Right. You may even have a special ability that gives you scale against like a high number of low-powered minions.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
right.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that you say that like when you grasp scale, when it clicks for you, it becomes really an amazing tool, because I think that part of the problem with explaining scale and getting the concept of scale across is that it is actually extremely simple.
Mm-hmm.
It is such a really simple, it's just a comparison. You just look and you say, 1 versus 2, which one's bigger? And that's it. And explaining that is actually extremely difficult.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a complex concept, but it is a difficult thing to grasp.
Right.
And so once you get it, you're like, oh man, this is so easy. I don't even know why this was giving me trouble in the first place, which is a problem for me because I'm like, it's easy. I don't understand why people don't understand it.
I actually have a thought on that, but before I go into that, because we're getting close to 10 minutes, if folks have questions about subsystems and subsystem design, feel free to put them in the chat. Please preface it with the word question so I can easier to see as we skim through. And as those questions are coming in, what's helped me to kind of get my head wrapped around, and this is relatively recent revelation, so it's not like I've been holding out on you or anything.
No, it's okay. It's good.
There is a difference between simple and easy. Scale is simple. It is not easy. It takes some effort to try to understand, but the implementation and use of it is, in fact, very, very quick and does not take much time or mental ability to apply once you understand the core concept. Similarly, I think the reverse are also true. Getting to game design at a higher level, a game can be complex and still easy. I often point to my favorite go-to example is the Pokemon card game. It is extremely dense, complicated mechanical system, mathematical system, but it's extremely easy to play.
Yeah, I mean, it's intended for kids.
Mm-hmm.
And also like Magic the Gathering. I was playing Magic the Gathering in middle school,
Mm-hmm.
and there are kids, small, like 10-year-old, younger kids who are playing Magic the Gathering just fine. That's a complicated game.
Yeah.
It has a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of mechanics, but it's easy to pick up and play. I mean, even something like Dungeons and Dragons, there's a lot of, it's not complex math, but there's a lot of math that goes into
Mm-hmm.
playing that game. Kids play it just fine. It's easy to pick up.
Yeah. And the reverse, the board game Diplomacy, if you've ever played it, it is an extremely simple set of rules. Basically,
Oh my god, that game.
there's no actual it's actually like the rules take place like half a page, but it is a hard game to play.
I really want to play like a epistolary game of diplomacy.
Oh God,
I think that would be amazing.
that would be amazing, and also it would probably not wreck friendships the way that straightforward diplomacy does, but
I
there
think it
will be
would
a lot
still
of
wreck
trash talk.
friendships. There'd be a lot of trash talking, yeah.
Oh my God.
And if you've never played diplomacy, it is literally what it sounds like. The only mechanic of the game is that you negotiate with other people, and it's a World War II simulator, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, World War One.
World War One.
Yeah.
Yeah, World War One. Sorry, I couldn't remember which World War. It's Axis and Allies. That's World War Two.
Correct. Right.
So yeah, diplomacy is a World War One simulator. You play one of the nations involved in that war, and you get starting pieces in your home nation and other places you might have taken over at the start of the game, and then you just negotiate where you put your troops, and sometimes you make alliances, and sometimes you lie about your alliances. And there's just some tokens that you put down. I'm either supporting this person's play or I'm sending troops this here. And then you just compare a number of troops and that's it. There's no dice rolling. There's no
Nope.
random chance. There's no special powers.
Nope.
There's literally just talking to each other and making plays.
Mm-hmm.
And it's vile.
Oh God. Yeah.
It's so complex.
And one of my favorite kind of weird examples of subsystem design, we're getting a little bit off the simple, easy dynamic, but the Illuminati card game actually has rules on how to cheat.
Yes.
If you cheat, it says you can cheat. Here's what happens when you cheat. Here are the parameters for cheating, and here are the consequences if you're caught cheating. So it actually has rules for cheating, which of course sets up the metaphysical concern of is it cheating if you're actually following the rules, if they're spelled out. But the point is that this is a game about backstabbing and manipulation. And so on the one level, it's kind of going back to Dick Came from the Sea, using mechanics to sell the humor of a game. That's one way that kind of does that. But also it's a subsystem, right? It's okay, some people will never use the cheating rules, but those who do, we have a way to arbitrate how to cheat in this game.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about like games like Coup or some of those other social social dynamics game,
Love Letter, yeah, those.
Love Letter, yeah, stuff like that, where like the whole point of the game is to lie to each other. And there's rules for what happens, like, but that's not even a subsystem. That's like
Well, right.
writ large how the game works. But you could play that game without lying ever.
Right. But
In fact, I do, and then people get all confused about it.
yes.
They're like, you have to be lying, and I'm like, I'm really not, because I'm so bad at it.
Were you in the Princess Gambit game? Where I think it was you or someone was playing Princess Gambit game where they just never lied and no one believed them.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely played a round of Princess Gambit, I think, at Midwinter back when, like in 2020, when we were
Right.
allowed.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I thought that was right.
Yeah, and I don't lie during those games. Because every time I lie, I get caught, and it's so much better to not lie and then have everybody else be like, "Oh, you're lying," and I'm like, "No." And now you're in trouble because you called me out.
Right.
Oh yeah, Battlestar Galactica is also a good social deduction game.
We don't have time, but insert here my rant about how there's a handful of licensed games that are amazing, but because they're licensed, they come and go so quickly that they can never be truly appreciated. And Battlestar Galactica is absolutely the pantheon of genuinely excellent game design that until license allows it to come back, we're never going to see again, unless someone reverse engineers it into a different game.
Yeah, I mean, that's a game I will never get rid of because of that. Like, I love it. It's such a good game.
Right. And certainly, given that we are a company that has some licensed games, it's something else to keep in mind. Oh, hey.
Right.
Let's keep in mind. I'm trying to see through someone, Phantom of Truth, had a question of would scale be more of a logarithmic measure if you gave it a comparative value analog? And the answer is maybe. It's not a comparative analog, so I mean, I can't answer that question.
Yeah, maybe.
Well, I mean, I'm sorry, it's not an exact analog. It is comparative, but I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily logarithmic. It's just kind of bigger. That's part of the reason why we do have the examples, because we get, and to kind of Daniel's point, we tried to use real world examples because we knew that if we gave it a mathematical scale, people were going to feel like it was a rigid structure that had to be exactly followed. It's kind of like how in the original Marvel Superheroes tabletop role-playing game, you could live 2,000 pounds or 5,000 pounds. So if you live 3,500 pounds, there's no way. You can only do one or the other. And so it gets weird when you apply that too rigidly. But from a comparative view of like just rough math, yeah, logarithmic sounds about right.
Yeah, it sounds right, but also not everything... not everything utilizes logarithmic or utilizes math in a way that like makes sense. I don't know. That could be right, but I also am loath to put actual numbers to it because that's not the point of it.
Right. It goes to if you are again from a judgment standpoint, at some point in time you have to have numbers in which by definition of numbers codifies things, so you can have this weird catch-22 of you want to give enough texture and understanding and contrast so that those numbers have meaningful in your head, but that meaning can shift. And it reminds me, I just now thought of this, Agile Methodology. In Agile Methodology, they have a concept called story points. The relevant point of this is that it's a way to weight tasks. If I have two things on my sheet, which is send email and write book, they look identical on the page, but obviously writing a book takes way longer than sending an email. So you assign story points to that to give it a different weight. So writing a book is 13 points, sending an email is 1 point. That does not mean writing a book is 13 times as hard as sending an email. That's just an arbitrary metric so that you can look at a task and go, okay, this will take me approximately X amount of time. And that's how much it'll take you X amount of time. So for me, writing a book might be 13. If I were to use my scale for somebody else, they may consider it to be a 30 or a 40 or just impossible because their scales are going to be different. You can't apply my scale to them. So when using scale, again, because it's comparative, in your game, you may consider Godzilla to be a 3 or a 4 or 5 scale. But if you're playing a Power Rangers game, that's going to be 1-to-1 scale. Those Power Ranger in Zord to giant monsters are going to be 1-to-1. They're exactly the same scale. So it's all... Again, this is a weird moment of like, each game by design should be looking at scale slightly differently. We can't always codify that because we can't tell you what's at your table, but we do have to give you enough context so you understand what these numbers mean. So it is a tricky balance. We thought we nailed it. Obviously, we didn't. I do feel like each book that's come out and each game that's come out, we've zeroed in better and better on that because we're hearing less and less of these concerns or questions. It was just that Aberrant Game was kind of ground zero for, okay, here's scale everywhere and how do we apply all that and everything. And no worry, Phantom of Truth. I mean, that's part of the point we're doing these things is because it gives us a chance to get the stuff out of our head because, as I mentioned in episode 1, if we weren't in front of a camera doing this, Danielle and I would be in a Discord call having pretty much a very similar conversation because we often do.
Yeah. I mean, we wound up talking not yesterday, last week we were doing our prep for the show and we wound up talking about scale in general because I was like, I think we should maybe cover scale. Oh, fucking scale. And then we wound up talking for like a good 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Just about like what we wanted to say about scale. So like we would just be having these conversations, and we do. So just because we're in front of you doesn't mean, you know, and taking your questions and trying to gear them towards the things that you would be interested in seeing. That's just, you know, a benefit. Like there's just a side benefit that's extra of the conversations Eddy and I already have.
Right. So you guys get to benefit from the nerdity that we always do.
Right.
So on that note, we are out of time.
Yep.
Danielle, if people wanted to ask you about scale, where would you be avoiding that conversation at online?
Yeah, don't ask me about scale. God. Why would you?
Why would you do that?
So why would you? So you can find me probably in the Discord, in the Onyx Path Discord. Sometimes you can also find me online on Twitter, and you can, most of the places that I hang out, Discord is probably the most reliable of places that you could find me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Same for me, honestly. Finding me on Discord is probably your best bets these days. But when I am on social media, I am on Twitter as Pugsteady, Pugsteady. You can also find all of my work at pugsteady.com. And in important updates, my tea is empty now. My teapot is completely empty through the course of this.
My tea is mostly empty, but it's gotten cold at this point. Oh, that's a nice little
have you seen
teapot with a cozy on it.
It actually has a place where you put the tea leaves directly in, so you don't need a tea bag. So I can literally just dump the loose tea in there, pour the water in, and it keeps it warm. Yeah, it's fantastic.
That's so cool.
Got on Amazon for like $20. It's ridiculous.
I need a new electric kettle because I think the metal on mine got corroded. I have been really bad. Well, we have really hard water.
Oh, okay.
And I've been really bad about adding softener salt to my water softener filter because the pandemic. Which means that it's been hard water, and well, I think it's gotten a little corroded, and so now it's like there's nothing I can do about fixing it.
Right.
So I need to get a new one, but they have some that like you can set the temperature specifically for tea. Nice. And so I'm thinking about getting one of those bad boys because I have some teas that are like a little more temperature specific.
Mm-hmm.
So that will be, I'm going to try that out.
Yeah. There's one that I used to have, it's like a button for oolong, there's a button for white tea, button for green tea. Also, that sounds like that teapot is screwed, but for future, I found also if you take a solution of 1 part white vinegar, 1 part water, and then boil it in the teapot, that actually helps kind of clean some of the scale off of it, which can help.
I've been doing that, and it came back immediately, so that's how I knew it was borked.
Oh yeah, no, never mind. It just sounded as bad.
Yeah.
But anyway, so yes, if you want to hear more discussions from us, it will be this time in 2 weeks. And I think right now we kind of touched on this, but I think we're going to go more deeply next week into genre, how game systems handle and emulate genre conventions. So that'll be kind of probably using They Came From Beneath the Sea as our ground zero to talk about that. But as usual, we'll kind of wander around to talk about other games as well.
Before we go, really quickly, sure. I promised the BXP Discord that I would show them the thing that Terry made me for Christmas.
Oh no!
Which is this. I don't. Oh, there's a ring light, so it's hard to see. Can you see this? Is it backwards, Crunch Dog?
No, you can see it. Yeah, Crunch Dog.
Okay, cool. So it's got like, it also changes colors and everything. Oh yeah, it's nonsense. So there we go. So that is. Harry has a laser cutter and apparently loves laser cutting things, and made me a little standee of myself as Crunch Doc. Partially why I was so keen on calling this Crunch and Lunch or Lunch and Crunch. because I thought that's hilarious.
No, totally. And so now you can lean into your crunch dog status.
Yes, crunch dog. That's
Well-
even better.
Well, crunch dog, I will see you in 2 weeks.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.